Well, Mr. Rudd, thank you very much indeed. We have a number of questions, and we had more questions than we had time in the last session. So what I plan to do is I'm going to invite Archbishop Wilson, the President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, to ask the question he did in the first session, because I think it's a very relevant one, although it's been in part answered, and then we'll move on to new questions. Thanks, Archbishop.
Thanks very much, Tim. Mr. Rudd, what are the personal qualities as opposed to the political qualities that you believe are necessary for authentic leadership? What role, if any, has religious faith had in forming your leadership qualities?
I think the key thing with leadership is to know what you believe in and why. I think the key thing about leadership is, as I said before, not to oppose for opposition's sake, but if you are going to oppose, then to propose what you'll do by way of the alternative. I think leadership is also about admitting there are things that you don't know. I think leadership is about being fair dinkum, about what you can fix and what you can't. I think leadership is also about recognising that we have finite knowledge and a finite capacity to fix all human problems. And for me, my own way, in quiet, prayerful moments in this place, Canberra, reflecting on what I can do constructively to make this a better and more humane country, and recognising that all those who sit opposite are not sons of the Antichrist.
The next question is from Mr. David Perrin, the National President of the Australian Family Association.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. Mr. Rudd, can I thank you for your personal support and for your party's support for the amendments to the Marriage Act, which mean that marriage is now only between one man and one woman. However, you may be aware that the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission have recently made a recommendation that the definition of de facto marriage be extended to include homosexuals. And not only that, but the definition of parenthood be made gender neutral. Would your party reject these attempts to undermine marriage?
I have a pretty basic view on this, as reflected in the position adopted by our party, and that is that marriage is between a man and a woman. I haven't read the Haire report, to be quite honest. We've been engaged in a few other things. My understanding is there are 2 or 3 sets of recommendations in it. One is for same-sex marriage, another is for civil unions, and a third is for what is described as a relationships register. Our party's policy in response to that is we do not support the first, which is same-sex marriage. We do not support the second, which is civil unions. We are, however, prepared to embrace the possibility of relationship registers as they exist at the state level. And I understand that a number of the churches represented here have themselves put forward submissions on this matter as well. Such relationship registers do not begin with a marriage ceremony. They are about the registration of relationships, same-sex or non-same-sex, but those which exist outside of marriage.
The next question is from the Reverend Professor James Haire, the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture.
Mr. Rudd, I want to ask you a question about Australia's place in the world, particularly in relation to refugees. We have a long and proud tradition in this country of receiving refugees. When, at the end of the Second World War, Ben Chifley received a higher number of Holocaust survivors than any other country in the world. But we've had problems in recent years. So I want to ask you what measures your party would take to improve the processing and the welfare of refugees who arrive on our shores by irregular means, whilst also protecting the security of Australia's borders.
It's interesting you mention Chifley and his then Immigration Minister Corwell. who changed the face of modern Australia through post-war immigration policy. And your reference to the immigration of Holocaust survivors is absolutely right. One of the reasons why it was important for us to do that was the posture we took before the war, together with the rest of the collective West, who, when convening, I think in the late 30s, at a conference in Europe to discuss the Jewish question, Australia, together with others, turned its back on the requests for safe haven. In fact, if you visited Yad Vashem, as I have in Jerusalem, the Holocaust memorial, it's one of the confronting things as an Australian is when you walk in, and I think the very first display, at least when I saw it a few years ago, is from the Australian delegate to that pre-war conference saying, and I paraphrase here, "It is not for us to solve the Jewish question." I think we should be mindful of our history and incorporate it into how we act differently in the future. And post-war governments have sought to do that. But what it goes to is this. Why we have this thing called the Refugees Convention is because we resolve that when anything like this ever happened again, that is, like what was inflicted upon the Jewish people of Europe in the last World War, that we would have an international mechanism to act and to deploy. And that has been why Australia initialed and signed, and then I think under Menzies finally ratified that convention. And since then we have taken many refugees, as we should. When it comes to the future, I want to make sure that this country maintains an open heart. And that means that when it comes to things like mandatory detention, that we do so for practical purposes like health checks, practical purposes like security checks, but that there is no such thing as indefinite mandatory detention. We must also make sure that people are processed within a reasonable and humane period of time. That means resourcing it properly, 90 days. It means also that we must maintain an effective and meaningful quota for the country when it comes to the refugees we take into this land every year. I think we're one of only 16 resettlement countries across the world, together with many in Europe. We must continue to shoulder the burden. And I say this in conclusion to James's question. If we are seen to walk away from all of that, it says something very bad about the Australian heart internationally. If we are seen to walk partly away from that, it says something very bad about us internationally. But even worse than that, if we as one of the initiators of the post-war Refugee Convention consensus are seen to be fragmenting it at the edges, we also are part and parcel of fragmenting the global consensus and machinery for dealing with refugee challenges into the future. And I never want to be part of any such government that does that.
The final question for the evening is from Pastor Dale Hewitt, the National Leader of the Apostolic Church in Australia. Thanks, Dale.
Mr. Rudd, I guess in light of the recent application of anti-vilification laws in Victoria, what guarantees can you give the Christian Church that freedom to preach the gospel will be protected by a Rudd Labor government, even if that gospel is unacceptable or perhaps even offensive to other groups that have differing views? I'm asking this really to discover from you whether the Labor Party has any plans to initiate a Bill of Rights or even some kind of racial or religious tolerance type policy federally.
As you know, across the Christian and wider religious community, this is a vexed subject. Arguments in all directions. I'm acutely conscious of the vilification cases in Victoria. I'm acutely conscious of this country's long and proud tradition of freedom of speech, freedom of association and freedom of religion. These things have been around in this place ever since the King's Dominion governors allowed Irish Catholics to celebrate Mass, Archbishop, in the early days of the penal colony. I discussed this recently with Cardinal Pell. Well, not that recently. So how you deal with this in the future is a very, very complex legal question. I'm acutely conscious of what happened in the 80s when a constitutional referendum was proposed concerning freedom of religion and the entrenchment of that constitutionally, and how it sank in a blaze of constitutional and referendum-based non-glory. Therefore, when it comes to better protections for the future, I'd simply prefer to be frank with you. We don't have a magical answer to this. I am concerned about any incremental erosion of basic freedoms in this country, because it's part of who we are as Australia. So if there are better forms and better mechanisms for protection available through the law in the future, can I say this? We would do so in complete consultation and partnership with the Christian community on the way through.
Well, Mr. Rudd, thank you very much for your time. I know everyone very much appreciates your giving us in what is a very busy time. I know we're not into the campaign yet, but I know that you're working at a million miles an hour.
Where you been, Jim?
And I do want to say too, as we said to the Prime Minister, that we are very much aware, and certainly those of us who are close to politics, very much aware of the incredible drain that politics is on you personally, the great challenges it is to family life, and we do really appreciate the commitment you make on our behalf, and we appreciate too that you're putting yourself up as being willing to take the biggest share of that in the event that you're elected Prime Minister. So thank you very much indeed.